Good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock and it's time for me to open day 9 of the examination into the plan of Royal Borough, Kensington and Chelsea. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Louise Nelson and I'm the Planning Inspector and Secretary of the State to examine this plan. We use microphones and to turn them on, you turn them on and off, obviously, but because of the way the system's set up, only one person's microphone can be on, otherwise it causes problems with the camera. We'll have a mid-morning break. The council normally supplies coffees, which I believe are next door. Yeah. There's no fire alarm planned, toilets are on this floor, and as courtesy to everyone in the room, can people just sort of not chat to each other during the proceedings, because that's quite off-putting to everyone concerned, and make sure their mobile phones are off. Before we start today, could I ask the council about setting a common ground with the Environment Agency, what the status is of that?
So we're very close to agreeing the statement of common ground with the Environment Agency. They have actually proposed a couple of modifications to the contaminated land policy. I have got some draft amendments to the contaminated land policy because the council, even before we liaised with the Environment Agency, we noticed a few things which would make the policy more effective. I've got some printouts of that, those modifications. But the common statement of common ground with the EA, hopefully it should be agreed in a day or two.
I mean, obviously it'd be exceptionally helpful to have copies of the changes that you're putting forward. Is it possible that you could circulate these now, and then people are sort of reading them when they're potentially getting a little bit bored or very helpful? In terms of these policies, I think the most sensible thing would be just to go through each policy by policy, rather than considering sort of higher level matters, because I know there's various concerns relating to detailed wording. I'm also aware that, conscious that we have some major representations that aren't actually being we don't have people to sort of advocate them, but I'm aware of them, so that's in my mind there. Okay, development 137 was basically, are these justified, effective, consistent with national plan and in conformity to the London plan? It seems that the Mayor considers that they are. In terms of relation to justification, there are issues that have been raised relating to flood risk issues, but again, we'll come on to them to go through. Okay, so is the policy of GB11 ambiguous in relation to circumstances in which the sequential test will be applied? You've suggested that there's no need to sort of duplicate the policies in the London plan or in the framework, but it seems to be throughout. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't in your plan, and I just wondered why you take the particular position you have here.
I'm James Latham, I'm the Principal Flood and Water Management Officer here at the Council. Yes, we took the decision here in terms of the sequential test because it's quite clearly set out in the NPPF. There's a footnote 55, I believe, and that gives the types of development that wouldn't require a sequential test. What we wanted to include in the policy is the characteristics and the flood risk within which we would expect the sequential test to be considered. So it's in terms of the flood zones and the critical drainage areas, because specifically the critical drainage areas, it goes into some detail in the framework, but because we have them defined in our surface water management plan, we included that. But what we didn't include was the exemptions that wouldn't require a sequential test in those areas.
Okay. Before Ms. Frame comes in, I just like to ask you more questions. And I'll just go through the obvious things for me, and then we can perhaps potentially open up a bit further. Vulnerable development, sleeping accommodation. You talk about self-contained basement dwellings in flood zone 3 will not be permitted, and sleeping accommodation will not be permitted below ground floor level in flood zone 3. Why isn't it the difference between critical drainage areas and flood zone 3 in relation to sleeping accommodation?
So in relation to sleeping accommodation, so in flood zone 3, which is broadly where there's a risk of inundation because of the flood defences along the River Thames, that's set out by the Environment Agency requiring that restriction. What we've done is extended that to critical drainage areas, but for self-contained units where there's no access or egress to the higher floors. We haven't extended the habitable accommodation in critical drainage areas because the definition of risk in those areas is more nuanced than flood zone 3. There will be development, there will be sites in the critical drainage areas that aren't necessarily at very high risk of flooding, but there are drainage issues in the area that are difficult to define. What we have done is included the requirement for assessment of risk in basement developments for all basement developments. So it's part D, number 3 there. So all basement developments require a flood risk assessment, and as part of that, mitigation will need to be put in place to make sure that the habitants and the use in those areas are safe over the lifetime of the development. So there'll need to be measures put in place to ensure that those the occupants are safe in those areas. But I think it wouldn't be appropriate to have a blanket restriction on habitable uses in critical drainage areas. It would be disproportionate to the risk in those areas. But we acknowledge with the basement and the requirement of flood risk assessment at basement that consideration will need to be given in those areas to make sure that those occupants are safe.
Thank you. In terms of E2, I'm just interested why you said may rather than will in the sequential test assessment.
That's what we discussed earlier in terms of it's only may because there are exemptions in national policy. For instance, household development and changes of use do not require a sequential test in national policy. So therefore, what we haven't done is separated out in there almost the matrix of the types of development and the location of the development. So the may in there is primarily because of the exemptions in the national policy.
Might it be more clearly expressed to set out unless it's exempted, it will, because when you say may, it rather sort of implies, how do I know whether, you might toss a coin today and say it'll be okay, and you might not, and the next day it's, it looks a bit like it's, I don't know how you're feeling that particular day. I'm sure that's not really what you're meaning, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, we would be happy to make it clearer in the policy and potentially include a link to the part of the NPPF that explicitly sets out where subsequent investment will be required in national policy.
I'm not sure that a link is necessarily the right way forward, but clearly needs something happening there. Yes,
Right. Thank you.
just remember to introduce yourself as well.
Yes, I think that your introduction, your
James Latham, yes.
yes, thank you. Kensington Chelsea is unique in the level of flooding we have. We don't have really the flooding that is actually outlined in flood 1, 2, and 3, which is really alluvial flooding. We have flooding from our sewer systems. I was flooded in 2007, a meter of flooding in my basement, my lower ground, along with thousands of other homes from the sewer system. And the thing that we worry about is that if you stay within flood zone 3, you're doing the embankment. You're not doing the areas that we know historically have flooded. And the importance of the critical drainage areas is that actually outlines very clearly what flooded in 2007, but might not even include the areas that flooded in 2021 with the same level of flooding. So we actually believe that it's incredibly important to not rely on the environment's national policies, but actually rely on our own concerns. And that is where we have flooded. And therefore, we should not rely on flood zone 1, 2, or 3, but we should rely on our critical drainage areas and allow those actually to adapt when those areas increase as they have. As for basements with living accommodation, our adjoining borough, Hammersmith and Fulham, it was flooded also as badly as Kensington, well, not quite as badly as Kensington and Chelsea, but was flooded in 2007, have restricted bedrooms in basements. No bedrooms and have been allowed in Hammersmith and Fulham for quite a few years. And we think that that's actually a proper proposal. And it's actually restricted in the land registry for the use of basements. We think that if it's just restricted to self-contained, it is actually not covering the issue of the safety of a basement. We actually have to kind of remember why we have the Thames barrier. We have the Thames barrier because the Thames flooded and over 60 people were killed in Chelsea in the nighttime in a basement. So we feel that this policy needs to be as strict as it can, and it is not.
Thank you very much. Christine?
Hello. I wondered if it could be a necessity to do an independent geological survey for all, to basically respect under the ground as much as above. Because I live in an area where a tree, for example, a couple of years ago, just fell, and it fell, it's a 100-year-old tree, it fell across a communal garden because the water, it was sitting in sulphurous roots. There is huge movement and flooding in the north of the borough because of the amount of development. So I know we've talked about this before. I just wondered whether it could be included, some sort of wording where there's an independent environmental assessment to assess the suitability geologically.
Thank you. Does the council want to come back on the points that have been raised, please?
Yes, I'll come back on both of those points. In terms of the definition of flood zones, I completely agree that the highest risk of flooding is from surface water and sewers in the area. But I do think that the policy as it's set out will ensure that not only just in the critical drainage area, but also properties flooded outside of the critical drainage area, and with the policies in place with basement development requiring flood risk assessment, criteria F of the policy requiring an emergency plan to consider access, egress and safe routes, assessing all flood testing criteria in part 1. I believe that it's sufficient in there to go to the level of detail that would be expected to ensure that the properties are safe in those areas. And I think restricting it just in critical drainage areas may not be restricting all habitable uses in low ground basements may not be the most appropriate to cover those spaces. Coming back to the point that was raised about geological assessments. So in current policy CL7, there's a requirement for the ground conditions to be assessed. So applicants are required to submit geological information with all whole ground investigation as part of that. And as part of that, we'll also need to consider the impacts of groundwater. So the basement's supplementary planning document goes into detail about the requirements for basement development, specifically to look at the geological conditions and groundwater in there. And that's upheld at the moment quite strongly. We'll continue to do so when that policy is carried forward into the new plan.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of critical development areas and flooding, if seeking accommodation, would it, and these assessments that come forward in terms of safe, the ability to leave the building safely, how would that actually work? If you did have a flood, how would it actually work in practice?
So as part of an application, we require a flood risk assessment ahead of approval for any development.
Yeah, but my understanding is that large swathes of the borough are actually within these critical drainage areas. So therefore, surely they are defined as being at risk of flooding.
Yeah, so there are considerable numbers of properties, existing low ground floor properties that are at risk of flooding. That and it was raised. We have our understanding is at least 500 properties flooded in July 2021. Separate to the planning policy, we have a local flood risk management strategy that's currently in the process of being revised, and that considers the roles that the council has as lead local flood authority to manage the risk of flooding in the area. Planning policy is part of that, but there's also protective measures and measures that can be put on the existing properties to protect, to reduce the risk of flooding or the impacts that flooding may have on those. So that strategy covers not only new developments but also the existing risk of flooding and the council's role in managing the risk of flooding, as set out in the Flood and Water Management Act.
Sorry, I'm perhaps being slightly. It's Friday. No, it's Thursday. You're not going to do it now. In terms of if I'm lying peacefully in my basement bedroom, and there's a flood event in the middle of the night, how am I not going to be flooded unless you either diverted the water somewhere else and therefore you're flooding someone else, or somebody wakes me up very quickly and tells me to get out. So, and my understanding, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that with any kind of flood management, you don't want to disperse stuff, you want to just slow it down. So moving it somewhere else isn't necessarily the first option.
Yeah, so in terms of the emergency response side, we also have a multi-agency flood plan, which is about kind of warnings and getting messages out there. But one of the main aspects of the current strategy and the revised strategy is exactly as you say, slowing the flow of water before it gets into the sewer. Many properties flooded because of their connection to the so Thames Water are surveying properties to make sure that the water doesn't come from the sewer back into the property. So looking at those interventions, those measures, to make sure that the connection to the sewer network only goes in one direction, only goes from the property out into the sewer, and it isn't allowed to come back. So that's one measure that's being currently implemented, has been implemented for quite a few years. But so Thames Water, because they are the water and sewerage company in the area, they're responsible for the sewer connection and managing the risk of sewer flooding specifically. But we acknowledge that there are overlaps in surface water flooding and sewer flooding. So that's in terms of the protective measures, but we're also, one of the main management activities is sustainable drainage, and we'll get onto the policies there, but the council is actively undertaking schemes to reduce the speed at which rainwater gets into the sewer network through other projects, through other measures, as well as through development, so that there's more capacity in the sewer network to be able to reduce the risk of flooding to properties.
Sorry, I think I'd also add, so for the basement property in policy CL7, which is a safe policy, there is a requirement for a positively pumped device to be installed, and as well as for SUDs, so that is considered for each and every case. I think that has been effective, so there has been discussion whether fitting positively pumped devices have actually caused a problem where there isn't one next door. I don't think there is any evidence that so far that has been the case.
I mean, clearly that policy isn't for me, so I can't really comment on that. But I'm still struggling why sleeping accommodation isn't allowed in flood zone 3, but it is in the critical drainage area. So perhaps you could have another go at convincing me why it's okay in one and not in the other.
So the flood zones are defined from modelling where they expect the flood water to reach and the depth of water to reach. So it's much more clearly defined where water is expected to get to from the river, because they have a set level, and it's easier to say all of these properties are likely to have a depth of water that is sufficient to result in flooding. It's much more complicated with surface water flooding, because one property may flood and the property next door may not flood, or in those areas. So the critical drainage areas define broadly where there are drainage issues, and therefore within those we expect some restrictions to be put in place, which is what we have. But we can't guarantee the risk is high enough in those areas to put the necessary restrictions in place. Coming back to the point, I looked at the Hammersmith and Fulham policy, and CC3 of their local plan has a mirrored policy that ours has. So it says new self-contained basement flats will not be permitted in flood zone 3, or in surface water flooding hotspots where the flood hazard rating is defined as significant or higher in the surface water management plan. So they don't restrict habitable rooms in their surface water hotspots in the policy. So it's equivalent because of the uncertainty in being able to find that. So that's the reason why there is a distinction between flood zone 3 and critical drainage areas in terms of sleeping accommodation. It's the certainty at which flooding will happen.
Okay, so when you undertake a flood risk assessment, somebody comes along and does that flood risk assessment, what evidence do they bring forward which is going to be substantially more refined than the evidence that you have?
There is mapping for surface water flooding as well. So there are areas and pockets where there is mapped surface water flooding. So there are parts of the critical drainage areas that are at higher risk of surface water flooding, and that would be considered as part of the requirements of flood risk assessment, which will feed into the parts in section F of policy GB11. So that's the extra level of detail that will go into the flood risk assessment and may require there to be changes, or it may not be appropriate potentially to have certain uses if there is no access or egress. But that's on a case-by-case basis because there is such a difference in flood risk, particularly surface water flooding, because it's not something that you can see. Also, in terms of risk, because of the connection with the sewer, it was raised before that it's primarily sewer flooding. So if a basement's being constructed or if work's being undertaken in the basement, requiring sewer flooding protection may itself lead to a minimising the actual risk of flooding in the air for that property itself. So therefore, implementing measures may be sufficient to minimise the risk.
Okay, so why would you, so in terms of vulnerable development criteria B, why is a self-contained basement dwelling not allowed in a critical development area? Given that you've got all those specific reasons, not that you wouldn't, I mean, I'm just trying to clarify the difference.
Yeah, and it leads to the distinction in national policy. There's a difference between more vulnerable and highly vulnerable. So more vulnerable will be a self-contained unit in basement at the basement level, where all of the possessions, all of the habitable accommodation is in that basement. And we've taken the stance where, because of the uncertainty and risk, because of the potential for that, it wouldn't be appropriate for highly vulnerable development, which includes those self-contained areas, to be located within basement in critical drainage areas. But habitable rooms in the basement would still come under more vulnerable because it's not entirely, there would be access to higher floors internally within the property. They wouldn't rely on external access. So that's why there is a clarification and distinction between those two.
Thank you very much. Mr. Name, you want to come in?
Sorry, yes, it was just to clarify really that I think because of climate change, because of the ambitions people have for every square inch above, I was hoping that there was almost an independent panel with sort of the broader community element in mind that does these environmental assessments, because individual developers or projects applying with flood risk assessment are obviously going to be, trying to make sure that that individual development can happen. I think it's a much broader, more serious problem than individual applications, because it is about the movement of water through the borough and what's going on above the ground. And I see it and I'm living it, and I think it's quite catastrophic what's happening and what potentially could happen. So it was an independent and geological approach is what I was hoping, as opposed to it being tied in with the development's package.
I mean, clearly any professional who puts in their flood risk assessment is bound by their code of conduct, so I don't think we can impugn the whole profession. Ms. Franklin?
Several things. First, this is hard to see from there. That's flood zone 1.
So, I mean, if if you direct me to the, I mean.
Okay, where it
direct me to the
is,
plan.
it's actually, it's listed as RWKC CFRA flood risk maps. And that's, I would think, hopefully, an addendum to this document.
It's the floodplains are with figure 2.2 on page 50.
Yeah, I've got that ahead of me,
Yeah.
yeah.
That is a map of what flooded in 7. Nowhere near, I mean, I lived right there. Flood. And what flooded me was an 1860 sewer. Bazalgette built a fabulous sewer in 1860, not been increased in its volume since 1860. And it backed up into all those homes who were served by that Counters Creek sewer. So what we're talking a lot about basements, but let's talk about a house that is a lower ground. It was built in 1849 and flooded. And since 2007, lots have been said about what the council's going to do. That's quite a few years ago. And we're still flooding. So I do not accept the fact that things are being done that are productive in stopping flooding. They are not being done to stop flooding. And it's actually proven some of the things, particularly the ones near the gardens, didn't work at all. So we are still flooding. And I don't see this policy, the policy directs too much towards basement construction and not enough towards requirement of flood risk. Another thing is that you said there are overlaps. I would call those overlaps actually holes in the policy. Because you may have one building that's going to take care of itself and you're going to have a terrace that's not. My neighbor didn't do his and actually found he couldn't sell his house until he did the set himself. Thames Water put my set in. I was one of the first ones to be put in along St. James's Gardens. Since then, Thames Water are refusing houses that have flooded. And they are not putting in suds, they're putting in flips, which only can take, if the volume of the flood pressure from the sewer can flip a flip and push it through.
I'm sorry, Ms. Frank, I think we're getting, I'm talking about the policy, whether the policy is appropriate. And I
don't think it is appropriate. It is not strong enough and it is not progressive enough to address what we have.
Okay, I mean, that's really what I'm.
Okay, that's exactly what
trying to pick in. So were I to accept that approach, what actually could, I mean, what is it within the council's toolbox in terms of the framework is on the basis that this is a reactive policy to development. I'm not suggesting, in terms of the council clearly has other strategies outside of the development plan, irrespective whether they work or not. Unfortunately, from my point of view, is not relevant. It sounds really brutal, but you know, what's the issue? The issue is whether, in terms of development coming forward, how, if there is anything that the council can do in line with framework to actually make any changes, and if you're following the framework, what else is there open to you, Mr. Wade?
Well, we are following the framework, and I think the other things that are open to us are obviously developing SUDs. We have a policy dealing with that, so obviously when it comes to new development, we obviously address that through SUDs policy. Separate to that, we have a programme of looking at SUDs. Obviously it is challenging in this borough, but we have a major scheme at Portobello Court that we hope to roll out fairly soon, and we'll be looking for other opportunities in the borough as much as possible. Just in terms of the wider aspects I think Ms. Crane knows this, we're in constant dialogue with Thames Water about the Counters Creek sewer and its replacement, and the merits of flips. And we've done a lot as a council to challenge Thames Water to make sure that everything can be done, because the combination of flooding in this borough is based on surface water and sewer flooding. That's absolutely right. So I think in terms of what the council is actually doing in the wider remit, we're doing, I think, everything we can. There's obviously always more you can do, but I think we are providing a very robust approach to Thames Water and making sure that they do fulfil their duties to minimise flooding in the borough. But I think in terms of the local plan policy, coming back to development, I think, you know, this policy does address new development coming in, and that's what's the purpose of what it's doing in the local plan.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to sustainable drainage now, please. In terms of the wording of this, how does it differ to the London plan? And is there duplication between the two? I have noticed one issue in you talk about runoff rates. The London plan talks about development proposals should aim to achieve greenfield runoff rates, whilst your plan says that major development must achieve greenfield runoff rates. I just wondered why there was a difference between the two there.
In terms of the wording or the distinction between the types of development.
Well, on the basis of the London plan says all, it doesn't say major, and it also says major.
Yeah, I think this distinction here is around part of the issue in the borough is there aren't really any truly greenfield sites, so therefore often it's challenging to expect greenfield rates to be delivered. But what I would say is we're strong in terms of major development and requiring greenfield runoff rates. But the distinction with minor development, specifically here with the 50% reduction, is acknowledging the existing constraints on the site and the realistic opportunities for those which are often very small sites to be able to meet greenfield runoff rates with the technical criteria required to do that and the infrastructure required to do that. So we make this distinction here to make it potentially more effective when considering the types of developments that we have within the borough and acknowledging these existing constraints. A 50% reduction from existing rates is still a considerable benefit to the sewer network. So the main distinction there is around the physical constraints within the borough and the types of development we're expecting.
Okay. That still doesn't actually answer my question relating to why the London plan really references all development proposals and yours says major, and I think you had quite a lot of representations from the development industry who've been saying that to say must achieve greenfield runoff rates is sort of slightly unreasonable and it's just unrealistic in the context of your development of your borough. So is there not an issue with by using the word term must and major rather than having it's an objective, isn't, your objective clearly is to have as high a runoff rates as possible, isn't it?
Well, as low as runoff rate.
Low,
yeah.
yeah.
No, sorry.
Yeah, so the other way around, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So how do you sort of square that circle in terms of your wording? That's Mr. Wade, right? Andy?
I think what we try to do this, well, I mean, in this borough, in terms of built development, size of schemes, what's coming forward, I think we particularly recognise that the cumulative impact of a lot of small development can cause particular issues in this borough because of the nature of the borough. It's highly dense, lots of hard surfacing. So we tried to address that through dealing with minor development. I take your point on major development and the policy plan in the London plan that says aim to, whereas we say must. We've obviously as a council tried to be as robust as possible. I'd be interested to I can't criticise the London plan. Is a difficult word because again I think it comes back to your point about what exactly does aim mean. I mean you could aim to do something that doesn't mean anything. I think we tried to make it more robust than the London plan. I'm not aware that when we've used the word must that it's actually caused so many problems, unless Mr. Latham tells me differently, why use the word must, which I think makes our own policy more robust and effective, would actually cause developers in the borough problems. I think using the word aim would provide a loophole for them, and I'm not convinced that's the way we should be looking for this.
You put forward a proposed main modification, which relates to as close as reasonably practical. And you put about household applications or equivalent must reduce the rate of rain or runoff from the site. So you've actually you have tables and main modifications to address that.
Yes, and the main reason for those is, as Mr. Wade said, about the practical aspects of delivering greenfield runoff rates on the site, and there may be circumstances where a certain development can't reach those, but in doing so, the proposed main modification allows for the potential for off-site mitigation, so that wider surface water drainage within the local area can be achieved. So that basically the policy is not just get as close as possible to greenfield runoff rate, and if you can't, then we'll have to approve it because of technical matters. It's the proposed main modification allows for the potential for off-site delivery, which was recommended by Thames Water. And in terms of making the policy more effective, we would still be strongly expecting development applications to meet those criteria for greenfield rates. But this at least gives those options which we would not otherwise have.
New point C is really an implementation reference, isn't it, rather than a policy. But what you're saying is that in terms of I think what you're trying to achieve is to, in the same way that policies we were talking about yesterday in the carbon offset policy, you explain, you do as much as possible on site, and then you can do something off-site as a sort of commuted zone. This is what you're trying to say here, isn't it? But I don't think it actually says that necessarily.
Okay, can I just come back up one more on that? The other factor we need to bring in here is the sustainability of the drainage that's implemented. So there's a way to reduce runoff rates by installing big crated underground storage that isn't necessarily the most sustainable way of managing surface water. There aren't biodiversity benefits, there aren't other benefits. So in implementing off-site part of the scheme, it may be that in the circumstance where we would otherwise have a large underground tank that requires maintenance with no other benefits, we could expect an off-site sum for delivery of more sustainable drainage within the local area that provide the same benefits in terms of runoff, but also provide the other multifunctional benefits. So that plays into the policy as it's worded at the moment, and links to the point C5 of GB12, which is prioritising more sustainable SUDs and where underground attenuation tanks are not prioritised.
I mean, surely the missing link is between B and C. The read is two self-contained policies, two separate issues. And I think you, in your mind's eye, you've made that link between major development and you've then talked about subs design. Then you talk about manage as closest to a source as possible. And I think you're talking about I mean, I've come across it before where people do 106 agreements to alleviate flood risk, sort of higher up the hierarchy or lower down the hierarchy, etc. So the means and ways of getting more bang for your buck is what you're trying to achieve, isn't it? Other than just reduce the, as well as just the first thing, which principles is to slow down the sort of ingress of the water so quickly. But does that policy actually, as worded, effectively set that out? I'm not representing what you're trying to achieve, am I?
No, that's what we're looking to achieve. I think it does provide that link, and you know the potentially having the different subheadings breaks up the policy potentially, so it may not, you know, may break the association between B and C in there. But I mean, in terms of C is more about the expectations of what the detail of a drainage strategy or kind of what drainage is implemented on site is expected, whereas B is more about the quantum and the overall expectations set out for the final constraints of the drainage strategy.
I mean, I don't want to go into sort of a long discussion on this, but your proposed modification relates to 106 agreements, yeah? And you talk about this is your main 115. We're agreeing for runoff rates, blah blah blah. Legal agreement may be entered into the delivery of subs off-site. Now, as I said, you can't really sort of, it's not really a policy, but what you want to say is if you can't do it on site for these various reasons, you can do it off-site for a commuted sum, and then, but you've got to be clear that, you know, I mean, but that's over you to implement.
Yeah, so I think I'd say that we have done that elsewhere, as you said, in our energy policy, for example. So I think we can look at the wordings as Mr. Baton explained, that C is more about the design of the search itself. So I think we can perhaps, reword the criteria as put in, and this make it very clear that where it's robustly demonstrated that greenfield runoff cannot be met through the measures that have been put on site, then we would then take an off-site approach or a commuted sum, and then add in the reason justification how that will be secured, as we've done elsewhere.
Ms. Frank?
First thing on the 50% of existing runoff rate. I have a problem in terms of just thinking of the two opportunity areas. One's a Sainsbury's store and an oil depot. The other is a complete cleared site and railway lines right there. So I don't really understand how you get 50% of a runoff rate of sites such as that. That seems unworkable. The other is that having offsite, Kensington and Chelsea until recently was the densest borough in the nation. It's still pretty dense. Where is that other location that you're going to put the off-site? And as we said before, we're not particularly happy with in lieu of monetary payments. So, we can't store this water, but we'll pay you this much money. No. The water's still going to be there. It's still going to be a problem. I mean, energy, you may do some energy changes, but water is still there. And so we don't like the in lieu. We don't like the 50% of existing runoff, and we think it's unrealistic to say it's going to be off-site.
Okay, in terms of were the 106 to actually come forward, the council would have to ensure that 106 was actually implemented. I mean, it couldn't just be hanging around waiting to be, it had to be necessarily related, so it actually had to be implemented. So, and I agree, obviously, the most ideal scenario is that it actually takes place on the site. I have read the responses from the development industry who've talked about the hard impermeable surfaces in gardens and landscape areas will not be permitted as part of the development. Their concerns relate to, you're saying, will not be permitted. Now, clearly, there are means and ways of making, I mean, not all surfaces have to be impermeable, do they? There are things that drain, etc. So, you can have hard landscaping, which is developable. So, I'm not too. There has been concern about contamination and such, which I'm just going to raise here. You seem to have sort of poo-pooed that argument from the EA, or was it the EA?
Sorry, but was that in terms of source protection zones?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they were saying that because most of the land in the borough is contaminated, that by having suds, you're just going to be potentially dripping water into aquifers, and then contaminants would go into the water supply. So if you could respond to that, please.
Yeah, so there's one source protection zone in the borough which is around Knightsbridge, associated with a private water supply. But more widely in terms of contaminated land in the upper aquifer, predominantly mainly in the northern half of the borough, the geology is London clay. And therefore infiltration is often not possible as a route through. So just having sustainable drainage doesn't necessarily mean that it's reliant on infiltration to function. Were that to be the case, were a scheme to come forward that would rely on infiltration, then we would expect testing to be undertaken, and also when a contaminated when a site with contaminated land comes forward, that would require separate. So I think what we said in our response is contaminated sites would be considered on a case-by-case basis in terms of what happens with surface water management as well as the other aspects of contaminated land remediation. Partly because of there's only one source protection zone, we don't consider it to be appropriate in policy to have something that covers the whole of the borough necessarily. What I think in terms of the proposed modifications from the Environment Agency, it just highlights the need to consider Environment Agency guidance. So we're expecting that to be put into the supporting text in contaminated sites. So there's additional guidance around there, but given the general approaches to drainage, we don't consider it necessary to put that into policy.
I see you've got your thing up, but I'm just going to carry on. You talk about the council in criterion F, you encourage the retrofitting of floods in any development. That's nice and dandy, but is that a policy?
I think yes, because it wouldn't necessarily be a requirement of certain types of development to need to implement SUDs when they're not required. But I think it's useful as we discussed in terms of the wider aspirations of the council to have something in there that sets the tone in terms of other implementation by the council for other works and other developments. So it's therefore supporting the implementation of SUDs that would otherwise not necessarily require SUDs, partly because of the risk of flooding in the area.
Okay, well, I'll take that one away. Sorry.
That actually brings up my point. On G12C4, it says recognizing the opportunities. Now, exactly in planning policies, how do you recognize an opportunity? And how do you require that recognition to be done and actually implemented what you recognize? I've got a problem with the word recognize there.
I mean, I think the policy could, the gentleman, sorry, as I've said previous times, it's absolutely awful mate, but you haven't had the pleasure of listening to me for 3 weeks, and you'll know that I don't like expressions like such as and resisting or recognise. So it may be that with the help of Mr. Wade, you might be able to tighten up some of the wording to make it so that for, if we're a developer or a member of the public to look at the policy, they'd be aware of what it was actually going to do.
Yes, maybe use word implementation. Anyway, I'm sure we can take that away and make it a little bit more effective and robust.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd now like to move on to wastewater and infrastructure. Again, it's a question of perhaps some of the phrasing of this policy. You talk about supporting and then support major applications, taking an integrated approach to water supply and surface water management. Surely you're going to require them to have an integrated water management strategy in an opportunity area, but then you support major applications. I mean, I think you need to be clear whether you require that or, is it part and parcel of the development management process that these are brought forward? And that's the question to you, is it?
Yeah, so in terms of, integrated water management strategies will be required in opportunity areas, but there's no requirement for an integrated water management strategy as a specific document for all major developments. but that policy, what it does is it pulls together the drainage strategy, which would be required, and sustainability assessments that will be required to make sure that water reuse and water efficiency is considered in the round with sustainable drainage. So it's not that we would require a separate document as such, but this is just making it clear that we would expect drainage strategies, when they come forward, to have considered water management and water reuse, as well as the other way around. If you see what
But in terms of the policy, what you're saying is what you're expecting the demand to achieve, and it's not how you get there, it's what you achieve. So you're talking about you want them to take an integrated approach to water supply and service water management. To what end? And I think that's what is perhaps missing from this policy in terms of making it clear what the purpose of these things are. So development will be allowed where it, and then having done a quick check on your actual essay 1 and essay 2, you might need to double check some of the wording there as well. Just reference it back. Ms. Ray.
Again, the word supports, and of course the council supports this, but to what end? And so that's another one of those words that has to be maybe more robust. That we found it's acceptable.
I'd like to move. Oh, sorry, Mr. Ginny.
Sorry, just a quick point about the permission for quite so many food outlets in the streets and disproportionate amounts. For example, in Portobello Road affects wastewater because it can't get into the drains because the drains are clogged with fat. And then we had floods at Portobello, which were basically to do with the increase of eateries in that road. So I thought there should be an acknowledgement somewhere that in terms of what you allow people to do in an area is going to affect the amount of wastewater and its ability to drain away.
Okay, perhaps we'll quickly come in and see how the council
I know.
addresses that.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't think we can address it. I mean, Thames Water have a duty to keep sewers clear, and obviously there is a build-up of fat and solidified fat within sewers, and they work to clear that fat. So I suppose that's one of the issues that I don't think we can control it within the council. We don't control sewers. And I suppose the other issue is what can we control in terms of the uses of properties anyway. We don't have the controls that perhaps we used to have in any case. So, the number of eateries is not something that really we can control under the plan system.
Thank you. Can we look at Waterways now, please? Nips back into the Geological Chapter policy that we were discussing, the whole issue of people living on houseboats. You use that word you love so much, resist. You resist these permanent moored vessels, when in fact actually you've actually got a perfectly fine criteria-based policy afterwards. So I think it's just a question of ensuring that you make that clear. In terms of criterion B, require opportunities to be taken to safeguard and improve public access to the River Thames, Chelsea Creek and the Grand Union Canal. That sounds absolutely lovely, but how? And who is going to be required to do these things?
It will be the development that comes, which is either adjacent or has the opportunity to make those things. Have you taken on the required opportunities? Perhaps we can look at how that's further.
I think that's just what's needed. You just need something to make it clear. Ms. Frame, I see you're up, but I'm to give you some time. We talked about the 10 strategy. That looks to me like something that's sort of a supporting text. There's no sort of outside the plan making process, is it not?
Yeah, so just in terms of that, because the Thames Estuary 2100 plan isn't a statutory plan, so we wanted to include it in policy text so that it is added, so more weight is added to it, rather than it just being in the supporting text.
Again, sorry, you haven't had the pleasure of my company. And there is an element where if you put in something which relates to something outside the development plan, it's difficult. Because, I haven't examined it, not for me to examine the strategy.
I think in this instance it is important, but we'll have to find other ways to frame it. But the Thames Estuary 2100 plan actually is looking at the flood defence being raised along the embankment or along the river to prepare for what happens by 2100. So I think it's a specific requirement where development takes place, then they are looking to raise those flood defences. So rather than refer to the Thames Estuary plan, find some other way of expressing that, because it is a DM requirement, essentially.
Right.
Yes, on B, one thing is left out, Counters Creek. Counters Creek actually exists in the heart of the Earl's Court development site and should be mentioned in that in terms of taking the opportunity to safeguard and improve. Should be. It's there. And so that should be within B. On C, in rewording it, you might look at what you're trying to achieve, and you might include the Locks Road pumping station in that, because that's one of our biggest problems, as you know. The Locks Road pumping station is a listed building, it has to be manually turned on, and the flood in 2021, I believe, and you will correct me on this, was a result of the pumping station not being turned on. So maybe that should also be included in here.
Yeah, if I come back on the so upgrades to the Locks Road pumping station. So Thames Water have plans to do that as part of their drainage and wastewater management plan. I think the criteria A in GB13, where we support the provision of strategic wastewater infrastructure to reduce the risk of flooding, I think that covers it in there in terms of the wastewater infrastructure. And also, Locks Road pumping station is along the River Thames frontage, so it would, the requirements in B would be there anyway. In terms of the Counters Creek, there are historic sections, so next to West Brompton Station, there's aspects there. We include the Chelsea Creek in criterion B in GB14, which is the historic, basically the bottom end of the Counters Creek in the Old Kensington Canal. But I think it's probably better in terms of other policies, in terms of the green corridors and green links, specifically with reference to the Earl's Court development site, rather than including it in here in terms of waterways, because the historic remnants of the Counters Creek wouldn't really fit in terms of waterways, in terms of the aspirations for policy GB14 would be considered elsewhere in terms of biodiversity and green infrastructure.
But didn't you just earlier wax lyrical about SUDs in section 106 agreements and the ability of the green blue type activities? And is it appropriate to have waterways seen as such a discrete element? My understanding in terms of national guidance, etc., is that we're talking about multifunctional uses a lot, and you're talking about all the different benefits and these activities can, these resources provide. So I'm just be interested why you would sort of try to put a dichotomy between the two.
I think it's more related to, so the purposes of policy GP14 is specifically around the Grand Union Canal, the River Thames frontage, where there is the distinction in the types of uses and the types of development in those areas. The purpose of GP14 is not to consider all water infrastructure or bodies of water across the council area, so all ponds or lakes within there. So it is that distinction with the active uses of the spaces adjacent to the spaces adjacent to water, and specifically those areas. And you're right about the multifunctional benefits and the inclusion of water within and bodies of water within drainage infrastructure. But I think that's best covered elsewhere in GB12 and as part of the drainage strategy, but also in terms of habitats as well.
Thank you, Ms. French.
Yes, but I think we'd welcome if Cowers Creek was mentioned in the Earl's Court site. That's kind of retrofit, us going back and looking at it. One of the things that I know is being talked about is a use as a critical drainage area, not the mountain aspect, but the fact that it could actually handle their own flooding drainage. And I think we should encourage that because it's going to be costly and they might not do it because of liability. So if it's picked up elsewhere, right, but let's don't forget it.
I suppose the issue is whether you've got, I think it's fair to say your plan has a plan of many policies. And is there, do you have an overarching policy relating to green, blue infrastructure, and which makes it explicit? I do apologise if I missed it, if you do. Because I know certainly from other plans that I've examined, they're moving away from having having sort of specific topic type issues like this, and making it much more. I don't know whether it'd be possible for you to amalgamate some of these policies to make them perhaps more precise and also to make them more multifunctional. It may be something you want to go away and think about, but in terms, because that would then bring the issue that Ms. Frame has put forward, because you've not actually discounted what Ms. Frame said. You just said it's better placed somewhere else, and it's finding whether where is that else. Mr. Wade.
Yes, I totally understand the thrust of where people come from the admin sector, so I think we can take that away. I mean, we have ironically tried to move away from a policy for absolutely every scenario to more generic based policy that can cover a variety of different scenarios. But I think that's what you're saying. I mean, clearly there's a huge number of issues in this borough. We're densely populated, and it does inevitably mean that we probably go into a lot more policy detail than I imagine some other councils wouldn't, because it's just an issue here where it may not be elsewhere. But I acknowledge where you're coming from. Let's see if we can go away and at least have a look at that. Not sure at the moment, but we'll see. But I do understand the sort of thrust of making sure that we have a policy, and and which requires something to happen rather than perhaps sometimes requiring documentation to be submitted, but we don't necessarily say exactly where we go after that. So I think that's a sort of concept that we definitely need to take away and look at our policies and make them a bit more robust.
I think it might actually help the development industry if they're clear what they're actually trying to achieve, because I'm sure it must be, I mean, I'm not a developer, I've never have been, but you know, in terms of if you're got a massive site, you're trying to redevelop it, you've got a number of various different requirements, but you want the overarching issue is how we do a good development, and you set out in the policy that if you do X, Y, and Z, if you achieve X, Y, and Z, that's a good policy, rather than give them a whole load of hoops to jump over, which may not necessarily help them achieve that. But I mean, it's all I'm really talking about is the specific of this one and whether a GB17 really, to be honest. As is my one, but that's really what I'm talking about, GB17 and GB15 and GB14. No, I mean,
No, I agree with you.
those three, you know, come together could actually result in a much more succinct but much more effective policy approach. Ms. Lambert.
Yes, thank you. I must say we share your concerns, and it's not just within sections, it's across sections. And not just large developers, small developers too, doing something to a residential property. There needs to be something which draws attention to related issues, lots of cross-references. Looking at the conservation chapter, that every policy, if there's some related policy on the environment side, there should be a cross-reference to draw their attention to it.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to break at this point because it's 11, and then somebody have a coffee. I'm sure we'll be able to get everything done before lunch though, so we'll break at 11 and we'll return at 12 or 11:25 to be specific.
Say the refreshments are in the council chamber.
And they're in the council
The location
chamber.
has changed.
Continuing with this session relating to climate change and the environment. We looked at GB14 waterways, and the issue was raised relating to whether some of these policies were, there could be some link between them to make them more effective. Clearly, this is segues very nicely to GB15 on green infrastructure. And I don't really think I need to say much more. I'm aware that from the development industry there have been some representations made relating to A, whether the policy is actually achievable, and B, how it relates to large scale developments, in terms of how it actually be implemented. I see the council's tabled a couple of, well, more than a couple actually, several amendments to the policy, which relating to further proposals are expected to meet or exceed these scores. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, you either expected to do it or not, aren't you? I mean, obviously, if someone wants to exceed these scores, that's fine. You've got the SUDS element, but I think that will fit in with Mr. Wade has said he's going to go off and look at these policies in a realistic way, won't you? Anyway, Mr. Wade, that's correct. So I don't really want to spend too much time on that. But I suppose the issue I'd like to address is, were I to be developing a larger scale site, is it clear that, are you expected to have an urban greening factor score on every element of that site or on the site overall? And I don't think that's necessarily explicit.
So it will be on the site as a whole.
Okay, so in terms of if you were to be a large outline permission, you need to put forward some evidence, probably early doors, that you'd be able to achieve that. Is that? And then you'd have to be able to do 106 or whatever, how you'd actually control. I think you just need to perhaps put something in this supporting text that would make it explicit, both to a developer and to yourselves, how that actually would be achieved, rather than what, happily allowing something and then thinking, hold on, what do we do next?
I think actually for very large sites which do require an outline permission, I think we'll have to go and have a look at that, because it may be that we require that for each phase, rather than for the entire site as a whole. So I think I will have to go back and have a look at that. But yes, we can add some wording to clarify exactly what we mean.
Yeah, and obviously you need to cross-reference with SA1 and SA2 to make sure that that is suitably effective, because it may impact. I mean, you just want to make sure that you're able to achieve it, and to make sure that the plan, the policy is actually effective. I've noticed that you said you put some supporting text. Where the score is not achievable, suitable score will be agreed on a case-by-case basis. Is that necessary? On the basis that you were speaking earlier about how mature consideration, it's if it's consistent with the London plan, which my understanding is it is consistent with London plan as well.
Yeah, I mean, as set out in the modifications, it was done to reflect comments, but yes, I agree. I think the approach normally taken is that we would take material considerations into account, so perhaps, we don't need to acknowledge that.
And then on the basis that you're going to put in some supporting text, setting out how the plan is up. I mean, it's really how it's, what you're trying to achieve. My understanding is that the site allocation is the master plan, or however you do it, achieves all these objectives, but you've got to have all those tools in your box to ensure that it does. And that's why the policy perhaps needs to be pretty made on factor. Thanks. Does anybody have any issues that they'd like to raise in terms of GB15? Okay. Can we move on to GB16 now, which relates to parks, gardens and open spaces, which uses the word resist, but don't want to spend much time on that, the resist element. As a matter of interest, in terms of H, protect the open spaces surrounding the Royal Hospital from inappropriate development, both in the landscape areas themselves and in neighbouring streets. Can you explain what that means, please?
I think it's a reference to the fact that the Royal Hospital tend to have a lot of commercial uses that use their open space on a fairly regular basis. And although I don't think the council has necessarily a problem with that, because we understand that they want to use it in that way. I think this policy was trying to achieve a balance to be struck between its predominant use as open space in the setting of the Royal Hospital and the fact that there comes a tipping point where if open space is being used for commercial purposes for too much of the year, then its primary function is beginning to be eroded and lost. So I think that's the policy. I think was drafted on that basis, and with that scenario in mind, because there have been issues with that particular open space in the past.
In terms of control, you have though, isn't it? You either have control or you don't have control, depending on the number of times it happens, and therefore you need to actually. Isn't that the issue?
We do have control. I suppose the policy's there that if you do have a policy that's more explicit about control, it makes it a little bit more robust. I accept the point that yes, we do have control. I think it comes back to this point about how open space is actually used in the borough, and clearly in a borough like ours it's very intensively used. I think it comes back to that point, as I was saying before, about open space and it being utilised for other purposes.
Rather than homing in on the Royal Hospital, isn't it? Wouldn't it be better to just set out what your... Because to be honest, when I read it as being there's something going on that I don't know about, and you're making some bales shot across the bow, and it would be sensible just to make explicit what your issues are with work. I mean, because I know the Sports Council, did they not put in about meanwhile uses on open space causing problems to sports facilities, etc., due to them not using this, so the ground isn't kept in good condition. So it seems to me that what you're concerned about is that the use of these spaces causes problems from the over-intensification of it. Is that really the issue?
Yes, so I totally accept the point, Madam Inspector, that I think that the policy could be...
Just be explicit, call spade a spade, in what the problems
could
are,
be
so that everyone knows what...
Could be more explicit and be more generically
applicable. Yeah.
For just on one particular
That would make it,
space.
yeah, that made it probably a lot more effective, I would suggest, or make it effective. Right, Ms. Dinning, you got your
The north of the borough, I think the loss of open spaces surrounding this earlier council blocks, specifically, for example, Grenfell Tower, lost a lot of their open space, which affected the quality of life, but also contributed to the inaccessibility of the north. I'm very concerned about a lot of the redevelopment squeezing a lot of people into an area where there cannot ever be enough open space surrounding them to support that number of people. And it seems to me there's not a lot of protection for social housing open spaces. The communal gardens are protected, but they're private. Nobody can access them. And that's a very specific privilege, but I notice it's always included in the council's green spaces, but really it's so private, it's not relevant to most of the residents.
Thank you. I was going to come to that point in terms of when I looked at the plan of existing on figure 2.3 on page 60 of your plan. Is first the issue, what have you actually protected? Are you protecting all green space, or are you protecting space that's been identified in your study?
I think it's space that's identified within the policy itself. So policy DB16, it says that there's B talks about which spaces are protected. So it's metropolitan open land, public open space, private communal open space, and local green spaces where they are designated in neighbourhood plans, etc. And these are the ones which are then shown on this map, 2.3.
So incidental, like open space, that would be.
So that would be taken into account when a planning application comes forward, because clearly we've got all the other policies requiring improvement in rainfall runoffs, the urban greening factor in terms of betterment, biodiversity policy. So it will be taken into account, but clearly sometimes if a space is being reconfigured, you could still end up with the same amount of open space, perhaps more usable than what currently exists.
I mean, it might assist Mr. Mean. I don't think you were attending the session where we looked at estate renewal. And the council has is going to go away and make a modification relating to the quality of the environment. And that would include not the protection of green space per se, because clearly if you protect all green space, nothing could ever be built in Kensington and Chelsea. But the key issue of green space hadn't actually been articulated. So it's now going to be one of the criteria in the estate renewable policy related to the protection of the quality of the environment, including green space. I'm not misrepresented what was agreed on it.
May I just ask one question? No.
It's not really a question. I mean, if you have a
It's to do with the scale of the development at Sainsbury's Ballymore. If it happens, which I've looked at the plans of, there's very, very little open space.
well, I mean that's absolutely in terms of I can deal with the site allocation. I can't deal with a specific application that's coming through the system. Ms. Farron.
Yes, there was an open space audit, I think it was 2022, maybe 23. It's very interesting in terms of what it says. It says the north of the borough is one service. And you put one word swaps a few other spaces. It says the south of the borough is not service well in proportion. And when you look at particularly Earl's Court, which is noted as being in deficit, I don't see these policies requiring those developments that are coming forward as requiring, it says that require major developments to make a planning contribution. Now, what's that? We want green space. We don't want a planning contribution. We don't want more money. What we want is actually true, proper green space in that development or any other development. We don't want planning contributions. That's not right. If you look at what the way it works now is every park in the borough is overused. Contributions are being ring fenced and do nothing for the overall crowded parks. Holland Park has been used as the park within 400 meters for all of the Warwick Road development. For Holland Green development, which actually surrounds it, the Odeon, 100 West Cromwell Road, and most recently the redevelopment of Allen Street. It has reached capacity. The plan should note that no other developer can use Holland Park as their go-to space for their spatial requirements, or even contributions to plant more trees in Holland Park or improve something within it. Holland Park doesn't want any more money. We need more green space. Almost all developments are much further away anyway than what we're looking at for Holland Park. We think that GB 13 should refer, it's going back, to S4 or repeat the policies. GB 16 is not sufficient.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on, I see you've got your phone up. It's going to leave you for a minute. In terms of the making public time contributions towards improving existing, providing new publicly accessible open space, often you've referenced the opportunity areas and then major development. You sort of say opportunity areas will be required to do X, then you've talked about major development, whatever, and then one of the, do you remember right, first day or the second day, we were talking about Earls Court, the Council Rise Canal site, and my query was, I was playing, saying, got Kensington Chelsea is meant to be incredibly dense, set up as sort of, it's always the exemplar of dense, low-rise, relatively low-rise development. Why have you gone for tall buildings? And you said public open space. So if you've gone for public open space as being why you're going for tall buildings, then there seems to be a bit of a mismatch that you haven't actually referenced it in the actual policy.
I think I agree. I think B hasn't been, it's not drafted in the usual way that we've done it elsewhere. So it should actually first say that major developments are required to provide new public open space first, and then say that, well, they can make a planning contribution where that's completely not possible. And yes, we can reference opportunity areas first, as we've before.
In terms of the issue about existing open space being at capacity, I've got the actual open space provision document with me, in front of me at the moment. Does that suggest that these sites are at capacity?
I think we've not, I haven't got it in front of me, but I'll just sort of answer that generally. We acknowledge that there are parts of the borough, the southern part of the borough, where public open space, particularly in Earls Court, I think Queensgate there's virtually no public open space. Having said that, to a degree, it's compensated by quite a lot of garden squares, private garden squares, I might add, where there's quite a lot of private open space. So there are one or two walls where, given the characteristics of that wall, which is basically within conservation area and densely built up, where the opportunities to provide public open space simply aren't there, and we could provide some platitude, but it wouldn't really go anywhere. So I think so the way we've dealt with this is I think we need to recognise that, because the opportunities in those towards the new development to provide open space is strictly limited. Clearly, Earls Court is not one of those, so we do want to provide new open space at Earls Court as part of the opportunity area, and the same with Kensal. But I just think, in terms of looking at that, we need to bear that in mind, because often in the areas where there's a public open space deficiency, there are other opportunities, either through more private open space or well, being directed to the local, to the nearest park and open space. But I suppose what I'm saying is that policy can't actually, I think, provide new public open space in certain parts of the borough. But of course we will seek it where we can.
Briefly, Ms. Ray.
Sorry, I'm a little worried about Mr. Ray's reference to private Warwick Road developments actually on the affordable housing faces, central squares that are fenced off, and you have to have a key, and it's only for Warwick housing. We need to be moving towards open space, not private space, even when we can have development. And we've got to stop increasing the use of our existing parks, because they are over capacity.
I acknowledge Ms. Frame's point that when new development comes forward, there's sometimes issues between what's private amenity space for that development and what could possibly be public open space. But those are taken. I think you've given a scenario of Warwick Road. Again, I still come back to my point that really, where opportunities can be taken for public open space, we will take them. But those opportunities are limited. I'm not aware of major development coming forward where there could be an opportunity for public open space as well as private amenity space where we would look at those opportunities.
I don't want to go on down this far any further, Ms. Lambert, is that me?
Just very, very briefly, what John Wade says is right as regards certain parts of the borough which have lots of private squares, etc., and gardens. But there are large chunks of the borough, particularly north of Westway, where there just aren't large gardens or squares or anything of that sort. And if there's a major development like Kensal Canal side, that's the perfect opportunity for creating a real new open space.
I don't think anyone's denying that, Ms. Lambert. Gentleman from London.
Hi, yes, Michael Atkins from the Port London Authority. I just had a comment sort of regard to the supporting paragraph 2.122. Where there's a number of main modifications sort of proposed in there, which is welcomed, but we just had one outstanding sort of comment on around temporary meanwhile uses, particularly around kind of where in the London plan is very clear sort of around temporary uses on safeguarded walls should not be permitted if there's a viable freight handling use sort of available. I don't know that there's some kind of, there's a bit of replication policy in that paragraph at the moment, but it kind of misses that point. So to reiterate, as a part petition, we'd like to have a reference to that, given that by the time we're moving, I think it's 2025, the area is in the sort of land ownership, so there's good potential around that to be utilised for waterborne freight. Whether there's a temporary use potential within that time, the policy as it is at the moment, it kind of, it's more geared towards just having the meanwhile kind of use there rather than sort of making clear that it's on the basis of there isn't a viable freight handling use on that site available at that time.
So, so really what you're saying, what value is being, your concern is that flagging it as a meanwhile use of public open space then will fetter your opportunity to move forward and use it for freight in the future, cause you a whole lot of bad PR, etc., which really you could do with that. Is that what you're basically saying?
I think
In the
it's
nicest possible way?
yeah, it's making clear that if it's sort of consistent with the London Plan policy, then meanwhile uses are acceptable sort of on the basis that there isn't a viable freight handling use that's available. And I don't think the supporting text currently sort of makes that clear, that that's part of the context for that site.
And how is it actually referenced in Waterways?
to things, the supporting text.
No, sorry, I meant in GB14.
I think we mentioned it in GB19. So GB19, see the waste management policy, safeguards criminal law, maximizing its use for waste management and waterborne freight handling purposes. So I think we were happy to add the word cargo as well into that policy following the Port of London.
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
We were happy to add the word cargo within policy GB19C as well in response to the Port of London authorities, in response to regulation 19, which I don't think we included as a modification, but we're happy to do that.
So really, the question is, what's the advantage of supporting the provision of a meanwhile open space at Cremon Wharf? I mean, if you're going to be doing it, no one's going to, as a meanwhile use, it could be given permission, couldn't it? So why make it explicit in the policy?
I think it's one of the things that the council is very keen on developing a meanwhile open space at Cremon Wharf. Residents, there's a strong expectation that residents will benefit in short term from the meanwhile open space, and it's one of the council's key aims to develop that. So I think that's why it's been made explicit in this policy. I do understand Port of London's concern, but having read the policy, I don't really see why it isn't fairly explicit. It does say until such time as it is brought back into wharf use for waste management, waterborne freight handling purposes. So it's pretty clear that at an appropriate time, that use is a meanwhile use, and it may have to go back to a waste management or waterborne freight handling purpose.
I think you've sort of betrayed yourself by the use of the word may have to go back. I think the Port of London will say it will.
Yes, okay. So I might have used the word may, but it doesn't say that in the policy. But clearly, in the policy, it is. I think it's explicit.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I support the wording that's in there. I suppose just pointing out the one bit that's kind of missing from what's been carried over from the London Plan policy is just that element that if there is a viable freight handling use that's available at the time, then that takes the priority over a temporary use. So the principal aim should be on getting wharf reactivated for its use, and then once that exercise has been carried out, there'd be a bit more of a concrete time frame in terms of what the specific end date. It's all kind of geared together. So it's the one bit that's missing, I suppose, from what's been carried over from the London Plan. It's just that. But that's
I think on the basis of what you've said, that it's a council sort of objective, and that there's a strong expectation from residents is the word you've used, that it be brought forward. I think you need to be very clear in your supporting text and don't sort of, when you talk about will have the potential, maintain, I think perhaps phrase it in a way so the expectation is that this will be brought back into use. And in the meantime, strongly support it as a meanwhile use. I think that's really the comfort that you're looking for, and I can understand in terms of how significant it is. You know, obviously Kensington and Chelsea's clearly got lots of issues relating to scarce resources, but having riverside freight is pretty scarce as well, isn't it? And I think it's fair enough. You're not actually changing anything, you're just ensuring that the policy is more effective.
Yeah, we were back to make it clearer. Thank you.
Nobody else wants to come? Okay. GB17, biodiversity. I don't have any specific issues, although I think that the council will protect biodiversity I'm impressed that the council can do all these things. What you're really trying to say is you'll ensure that developments don't cause problems, aren't you, really, rather than saying that you're going to protect it. And in terms of C, all major developments required to undertake and submit a site-specific ecological impact assessment. I've asked how that relates to conservation design. So I'm not 100% sure what I'm looking at. Anyway, you answered the question. So. We talk about forthcoming regulations. I just sort of say achieve a minimum on-site biodiversity net gain, 10%, and then put into supporting text that clearly events might alter circumstances. Because this policy is purely just like a place marker, isn't it?
Yes, that's right, yes, we can move that to the supporting text, the reference to the Act and regulations.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Ms. Brown.
Yes, we agree that there's a lack of clarity on the blue-green network and green corridor. We don't know where they are. Where's the map? Can somebody show us where this green-blue corridors are?
I'm Hansel from the Ecology Service Manager. That. I don't know if it can be included as an appendix. So this is the map from our habitat survey that was done last year.
How can I find it?
I can send you a copy of it.
No, I'm a public.
I think this frame is saying
Yes.
when one is looking at if you're coming forward and you say, oh, I want to do something, and someone says, oh, you've got to look at the blue-green corridor, and you say, great,
Yes. So
where do I go there? And should it be in the plan? Now, the problem with blue-green corridors, my understanding, is that they're quite sort of fluid, excuse the pun, and that they may actually change throughout the plan. But I think in terms of, it'd be sensible in terms of the plan being more justified and effective, were it to be included in the plan. Is that what you're going to suggest?
yeah, we also have in terms of the income and biodiversity net gain legislation.
You speak more.
Oh, sorry. In terms of the income and biodiversity net gain legislation as well, we'll be creating a public-facing website for developers or anyone with all the information they need, which will include these maps and the information of the sort of single sites and protected areas need to be considered.
Would you like to
I think we can add the map as an illustrative map in the plan, as clearly for the purposes of the policies map, I think it's sufficient to include the sink sites rather than show the corridors themselves. But yes, for illustrative purposes, we would include a map within the little plan.
And I think that goes in with the wider issue relating to the blue-green biodiversity, green infrastructure, waterway issue, in that you're wanting it all to be together, but actually in the plan isn't. Ms. Frame?
It's very simple, similar to the critical drainage areas. There is no map in here, and we're not asking for a map in that, because I can find it on the web. I just want to be able to find this, and I actually do agree that we want a fluid aspect to this, and that if we put it in the plan, it kind of sets it in stone. And maybe it's better that it is, as other areas, accessible, but I wanted it accessible.
I think if it's illustrative, and if something's put in the sporting text at that particular time, this is the most up-to-date issue. I mean, I think any person in a large development will obviously want to do their own anyway. Thank you. I'd now like to move on to trees and landscape. GP 18. My first question, what is meant by criterion I5? Are you proactively encouraging tree planting? Are you sort of roaming the streets?
Well, we are actually.
Sorry.
We do. Tree planting in the borough is certainly again one of those is a council priority, and we are proactively encouraging tree planting. I suppose that it could be said as a statement of intent. I think sometimes policies that are a statement of intent rather than requirement don't necessarily don't have any merit. In certain instances, it's very helpful to have a policy hook where schemes are coming forward, where we can follow a policy hook. And I think this is one of those instances.
Right, I just want to actually literally just go through the policy. Right, the council resists the loss of trees of value based on amenity, historical, ecological value. Does that go over and above what the framework allows you to do?
As far as I'm aware, it doesn't. We can issue tree preservation orders, certainly in terms of amenity, historic, or well, certainly in terms of amenity and their value, in terms of the character of the area. I'm not aware, clearly it's not my specialism, but I'm not aware that there's anything that stops us resisting loss of trees based on those values.
But you're talking about putting a TPO on things, aren't you?
So I think because most of the borough is within conservation areas, so the trees have that protection in any case. I think that's just signalling that where new development comes forward, trees are of great value in the borough given the very urban nature of the borough. And as Mr. Wade mentioned, the council plan actually has a priority or a commitment to plant 400 new trees in the borough. The paragraph 131 of the NPPF talks about the contribution that trees make to the character and quality of urban environments and how they help mitigate and adapt to climate change. So I think, with regards to planting new trees, but as well as protecting the existing trees, which can be quite large and mature, where development comes forward. The policy is in line with the framework, clearly given the sustainability, the sustainable development objectives that run through the framework.
Okay, I mean, if you're talking about trees in conservation areas, then to be fair, you've already got them, that book anyway, haven't you?
But I think even outside of the conservation areas, for example, in the north of the borough, you've heard a lot about the Wernington Green development, where outline permission was granted many years ago, which included some trees being removed. So I think that there is a very strong community feel in terms of protecting existing mature trees in the borough. And I think the policy is quite right in signalling that at the very beginning, when new development comes forward anywhere in the borough, that those trees are protected.
Okay. I see that you've got your tab around, Christina. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just you can come back in a minute. In terms of, so this is your sort of protection of tree issues policy, and then you've got a landscape design policy, which is sort of like a afterthought, and you don't require it to be fit for purpose and function. So what do you mean by that? You're talking about landscape as built, aren't you? So what do you mean by landscape design? So it's a design policy, isn't it? So perhaps it ought to be phrased as a design policy. I mean, I just think it needs to be made more effective, because as the way it's set out, it's not absolutely clear. And in terms of, whilst the council may be doing all this tree planting and street planting, the landscape design isn't going to proactively encourage tree planting, is it?
No, but it can include tree planting. So within the landscape strategy, they will be looking at including trees and which would tie in with our policy on biodiversity as well as on how to tree.
So as part of your vision for the council borough, you want to encourage more trees within development. So the landscape design should include trees, basically. Yeah, that's what you're saying, isn't it? Yeah. Mr. Nick.
Bearing in mind where we are, particularly if this is about climate, is there anything that can be done to tighten up the wording to protect? For example, it was only last year that 3 or 4 mature trees were chopped down in the Wernington Green development. So I appreciate that was old policy that allowed the developers to do that. But therefore that presumably exists all over the borough. And is there any way of tightening it up to protect that? Because obviously newly planted trees take years to be relevant and often die. But these enormous mature trees, I would have thought, which are obviously at a fall in the side of most developments, but really should be aggressively protected. And it was very disappointing that they weren't.
There is clearly a slight issue that prior to development, this protection of trees, prior to development actually coming forward, that protection, unless the tree's actually got a tree protection order on it, it won't be protected. And whilst I accept that the council wants to list these lost values, that's at the time of having determined the planning application rather than prior to that planning application. So in terms of it's outside the examination whether they can, what the council's approach is to how they protect their trees. That's something that Mr. Wade might be able to give the general overview on, but in terms of the policy, it's not in the remit.
No, I think we've acknowledged that the Wellington Green loss of trees was the decision was taken that probably about a decade ago, and I think the council more than recognises that now that decision may have been different. I think moving forward, our commitment, as I've said, to plant, as Ms. Clarty said, 400 new trees in the borough is something the council is taking incredibly seriously. And moving forward, as I've said, I hope this will be a robust policy that we could, where we have control, we will resist the loss of trees. Clearly, any development that the council brings forward on its own land or other land, I'm sure residents and others will be looking very closely to make sure that trees are retained in all possible circumstances. So where trees are lost, I think there's a fairly robust demonstration that will have to be provided to justify that.
I think I'd also just add that the protection of trees is not just the trees on the development site, so there could be trees nearby, and the policy would then afford protection to those, and even if there is no TPO, because those trees would be outside of the control of the applicant or the developer. So by having root protection areas or putting in mechanisms to protect those existing trees, I think the policy is essential in that sense.
Can I also add that the biodiversity and game legislation will also support the tree protection because the trading values mean anything that's any biodiversity loss has to be replaced with like for like or like for better. Obviously, then in the calculations of the metric, it takes into consideration the time it takes for a tree to grow, and also anything that is counted towards biodiversity game has to maintain for at least 30 years. Which I appreciate it's not long in lifetime for a tree, but it adds some more protection.
Thank you, Ms. Graham, briefly.
Yes, 2 points. Excuse me, Mr. White, I disagree with you. It's not robust. The trees that I have seen, very significant trees, mostly London pines, removed in the next day of planning application comes in for a base. And there was one on Portland Road recently that was obviously a tree that was 100 years old, and it was removed. The application to remove it had been refused. They came back with a report that an adjacent property was being damaged. That was done by the horticultural consultant. And when we asked that the structural justifications of it be reviewed, the answer from the council was we don't have the funds to have a structural engineer look at it. So we accept the tree removal. Because we would, excuse me, not me, that they would be liable if the house had actually had structural damage. So it's not robust. And that's a really true problem. The other thing is that that tree was not required to be replanted. Now, you could have planted a tree that actually would not have had structural damage to the property next to it, but it was allowed to be felled without any action to replant. One more point. Tree pits in development. Trees were removed along Kensington Church Street when Lannister Square was developed. The locals have now said, where are the trees? Actually, I think the trees were even on the plans. But it turns out that Lannister Square used the entire pavement for their utilities to run And so therefore they can't plant trees there at all. And I would suggest that somewhere in here, it needs to say that designated tree pits that are a size to accept the size of the tree be required. Not just a plan of where they are, but actually a pit design of where they are. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, clearly, whilst there may be these issues, it's outside the remit of my examination of the plan, and where the council resources itself again is something outside of the plan. In terms of replacement trees, the council does reference require practical and appropriate replacement of a suitable size as possible. In terms of gargling myself, are implemented to ensure that the tree has the best possible opportunity of reaching maturity. That seems to be quite a long-winded way to say that it's just that the tree fell replacement of suitable size, and then in your supporting text normally you put something in about, well, only you'd obviously cover it by a 106, wouldn't you, or a condition that if it was to die or whatever, you'd replace it.
I think it's perhaps coming a bit back to Miss
exactly.
Graham's point about making sure that that suitable measures are provided to make sure that that tree is established and that it will mature. I mean, there's quite a lot of instances, unfortunately, where trees have been put in and they promptly died because they haven't had the safeguarding measures that would go with a tree to make sure that it can grow and mature. And I think that is a hook again to go for we do have trees. In fact, we've just adopted a new trees SPD where we give more details of how trees can be planted and how supportive measures with a new tree can be brought forward. So again, that's a reference to a hook within the SPD on that point. I think it goes a bit further than just talking about replacement tree.
It's fair, I don't really want to go much further on this because we've got a lot to get through. Waste management. Does the policy set out clearly your strategy? Is it consistent with your circular economy principles? And how does it relate to London's net self-sufficiency target? Can you particularly refer to the end of the plan period? What's going to happen there? It's just happen. I'm very pleased.
I was just going to camera you in a position as our waste as lead officer on this. I'll let Mr. Canada report in the first instance.
So we have a Afrikander RBKC.
Can you make my a bit closer, sir?
Afrikander RBKC. So we're setting an apportionment target by the London Plan, which indicates that we need to meet an apportionment of 122,000 tonnes by 2041. Our approach for meeting that apportionment target is to safeguard an existing wall for waste management purposes as well as freight tank handling purposes. So that will provide capacity towards meeting our London Plan apportionment. In addition to that, we've secured through a statement of common ground surplus capacity from Hammersmith and Fulham and OPDC to help us meet our apportionment. And then the remaining amount of our apportionment comes from existing waste capacity within the borough from exempt facilities. So those are facilities which don't require an EA licence to operate. So we feel we will meet our London Plan apportionment. I I would like a bit more clarification as to what you mean, what's going to happen towards the end of the plan period.
Well, in terms of net self-sufficiency, you need to be net self-sufficient in company basically, not. That's the objective.
Yeah.
I'm saying you have to be that. So, but you're saying that you're going to actually go out the borough because you've got these very risks.
Well, in terms of how our waste is actually managed, it goes to a waste transfer facility in Wandsworth, and then it goes on to another facility within London in Bexley, and is managed in that way. Now that service level runs until 2032, I think. Work has already begun or has been initiated on reviewing that service level agreement. The council does actually retain the right to continue to send waste there up until 2046.
So the next issue was in terms of 154. You talk about month-plan target of 123,000 tonnes of waste being managed by 2021. And you're going to do this by a safeguarding come on wharf and capacity secured throughout the ancient event come ground. Okay? In your I mean, you have to forgive me if I'm getting wrong and stick here. You're safeguarding Cremon Wharf and Adrian Sea, and then you D, you were talking about the permanent loss.
So criteria D is more about compensatory waste management capacity if criteria D is more concerned with provision of compensatory waste management capacity should there be the loss of the Moorn Wharf or part of the Moorn Wharf, which with limited ability to use for waste management uses.
I think it's just a criteria to safeguard against the Thames Tideway Tunnel, as you will know, Madam Inspector, they are still on the site, and there is a very large ventilation shaft or access to the tunnel at that location. And we are aware that they may need that space for ongoing maintenance. So I think it's just in the event that there is any loss that we have some compensatory waste management capacity that's found by the Thames Tideway Tunnel.
So the question is how? Because you said it will require compensatory waste management capacity in another appropriate location. So it seems as if you're going to go to the Western Riverside Waste Authority area. So it's not really been within the planning area, is it? Is it going outside of it? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not saying that you necessarily can, but I'm just trying to work out with how it works.
It does say that in the first instance, this should be in the borough. I think given the character nature of the borough, as you've seen in terms of the sites that we have in the borough, I think that would be quite difficult. But really, it is the responsibility of the Thames Tideway Tunnel then to find that appropriate location within the borough, because that's not something that we want to lose. We are clearly safeguarding the wall for the purposes that it's intended to be. And it's the responsibility then lies with the Thames Tideway Tunnel to first, in the first instance, find a site within the borough. And if that's not possible, then the next approach will be to the Western Riverside Waste Authority.
Thank you. Perhaps the gentleman from the Water Authority
Thank you, Mike Atkins, to London Authority. It was just a quick comment, really, I suppose, just in terms of the Thames Tideway Tunnel development consent order. So within that, this is kind of regard to the safeguarding wharf rather than waste, but just to mention it, is around their responsibility for Cornwall Wharf to make sure that when they're finished, that they maintain the viability of that site as a wharf for freight handling. So it's another avenue, I suppose, where there's an obligation on the tunnel to ensure that that site can be used for those type of uses. It's just a comment rather than sort of a recommendation on any changes in the text.
I mean, you've put forward some main applications which actually clarify things a little in terms of Paramount Wharf. But you've set out, as I say, it seems to me you've gone straight to the sequential test of going outside of London, and you've got your hierarchy that you go in, outside, and then not within London at all, but whether it's actually
So
in
this,
line with the plan.
the sequential approach doesn't actually go outside of London. It says elsewhere in London.
Right. But the capacity in another appropriate location. If this is not possible within Western Riverside Waste Authority area, and if it's not possible within London. Within London. Yeah.
Possible. Yeah, maybe we
Apologies.
should tighten that a little bit up for you. Because if you do go to paragraph 2.17, which is in paragraph 2.146, we explain it there as well. So we state in the supporting text, if capacity cannot be provided in the borough, then compensatory provision should be explored within the Western Riverside Waste Authority area. And lastly, if no suitable capacity can be found in that area, the developer will need to explore compensatory provision elsewhere in London. Now that is in line with the London Plan's compensatory capacity approach, and it has come out that approach has been included through a dialogue and conversation with them.
Ms. Lambert's been very
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to raise a point in connection with K3. At the moment, most of the borough does not have food waste collected separately. It goes with the general waste, although I believe it's an aspiration that it should be collected separately in the future, and certainly that's what the government appears to be moving towards. We've had a couple of cases recently of small developments of half a dozen flats or dwellings, where they have only made provision for the collection of recyclables excluding food and general. I think it is important that the policy makes clear that in designing waste facilities in new developments, it should look forward to what is likely to come in the future, and in particular the separate collection of food waste.
Thank you. In terms of the actual wording of policy, clearly it's quite detailed, and you sort of talk about consider recycling, composting. I mean, some of this looks to me as if it's more relevant to an SPD or an SPG, really, in terms of the principles, isn't it? And the principle is that developments should be provided to reduce waste, to provide facilities to enable waste to be stored safely and securely and without causing problems to those users, and we've got ways of accessing that waste to be removed. And I think isn't that fundamentally what the trying to achieve in terms of the waste management and new development?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I think you could perhaps make it more clear what your objective is, and then obviously how people do that is dependent on the scale of the development, but you want to make clear that they know, perhaps more in the supporting text. You've got lots of detail here, which is perhaps the only detail, because then people then think they've done all this, and then they discover that you've got circumstances that have changed, and obviously, is that up to date? I mean, in terms of, sorry, I haven't got my microphone on, to apologise, should have said something. In terms of the issue raised by Mr. Janine about hot food takeaways, there is an actual criteria in this policy relating to that on waste. But again, you've used expressions such as hot food takeaways, you know, so it's really, you're talking about commercial stuff that's got some impacts, address them. You're saying its development will have an impact, you have to address it and ensure that your development management colleagues don't forget waste, because obviously it's the thing that everybody forgets, isn't it, frankly, when they're dealing with the planning application. So that's what you want them to do. I think Mr. Wade probably will be able to try and use some
Yeah, absolutely.
mentoring on this development.
I accept your point, Madam Inspector. We do go into a lot of detail on a policy where I think the criteria could be more generically worded, and then we can include criteria within supporting text.
Yeah, it's make it effective, to make the policy effective, because you want to make it effective over the lifetime of the actual plan. Ms. Lambert, you still have your don't worry now. Oh, no, don't worry. Okay. Before I leave this topic, could you give me a little bit more detail what's happening on the old oak sidings, please?
So the old oak sidings is a site. Sorry. The old oak sidings is also referred to as Paraday. It's a site which is safeguarded for waste management purposes by OPTC, which is a Mayoral Development Corporation, in their recently adopted local plan. I think it's also referenced in Hammersmith and Fulham's local plan, which was adopted not too so long ago as well. In terms of your initial question that you set out in your letters, issues and questions, the council is actually quite confident that capacity at Paraday will come forward throughout the lifetime of the plan period, given that there's quite a firm commitment in the OPDC local plan to bring that capacity forward at that site and to work with the actual operator of that site as well. I think that's roughly I'm able to say at this moment in time.
So the certainty is that it's in the development, in the OPDC development plan. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, and it's actually an integral part of OPDC's strategy for growth in their Mayoral Development Corporation area.
I just want to double check the main modification relating to criminal law being referred to the mayor. You made a main mod saying that it must be referred to the mayor. I just wondered, on the basis that you've made a main mod, I don't need to discuss any main mods that you put forward. So does that make the plan more effective? by stating that it's GB 19 Main 128. Any application for development of criminal law must be referred to the Mayor of London as set out in the Minister of Direction, but for the purposes of effectiveness.
So by virtue of the ministerial direction, it would be referred to the mayor in any case. So just to provide a bit more clarity, that's all.
Right, does anyone have any further issues relating to us?
Waste management in general.
Well, I mean, I was about to close this particular hearing session,
Okay.
so now's your time
I-
to speak if you do want to speak.
I do apologise for my late intervention. My question relates to a regulation submission, a regulation 19 submission of mine that I believe the council is aware of, and we raised the issue in the break today. And it refers specifically to the limitation of GB19 in addressing the potential for the rest of the borough outside of new development to adapt from a linear system of waste management to a set of closed loop systems of waste management. I refer particularly to the vulnerability of storage spaces in Victorian conversion housing, terraces, that features under pavement cold storage spaces which are used currently by the residents of that entire building as a communal waste storage area. Now, as I understand it, planning allows for the conversion of these spaces to uses other than as a communal waste storage facility. Without planning permission, therefore, there's no safeguard in place to retain these spaces for communal use or for upgrading to closed loop waste management systems where different streams of waste could be pre-sorted for collection and routing for other uses, and for waste to be kept at as high a value as possible before finally ending up in landfill, which I believe is something that the borough is keen to avoid in the future. So overall, my desire would be for something in policy that safeguards such spaces for use in this way in the future, and ensure that the existing built environment can partake in the closed loop system economy as much as new development.
I think if we look at GB19 and criteria K, it does actually reference that issue, and I'm sure the council will ensure that it is continues to be referenced. Ms. Frank?
Yes, I'm not sure if this is the opportunity to actually address construction waste. In particular, I'm talking about soil. The attitude at the moment on soil, as soon as it leaves this borough, it's not the borough's problem. And I think that when you look at the volume of soil that's being removed in some of these basins, particularly things like Newts Lodge, which required 3 months of 50 heavy goods vehicles in and heavy vehicles out. And we asked where the soil was going, and we were told it's not there, it goes out. Kensington says it's not the problem. And perhaps this is an area where we actually can address soil removal, because it is waste.
It's waste when it leaves, and then when it gets treated, no longer waste. The whole concept of waste is very, it's magic, things change. But in terms of perhaps some of the gentlemen from the council will respond to that issue relating to construction waste going on site. Are there any facilities for cleaning waste, for soil decontamination here?
There's nothing in the borough, but clearly we, in line with the circular economy, and one of the items that developers are required to submit in their circular economy statement is to demonstrate how waste will be managed sustainably and at the highest value. And that includes the management of demolition, excavation and construction waste. So the policy within the circular economy requires 95% of that waste is actually recycled, reused. But with regards to exactly where it goes, I don't know.
Some of our C&D waste is exported. We did undertake an engagement exercise with import-export authorities, so other waste planning authorities that receive the output of our waste, and no issues were identified with waste movement. But as Preeti's already mentioned, we have included in our policy the London Plan target requirement of 95% of C&D waste to be reused, recycled and recovered, which will ensure moving forward that as much of that waste as possible is managed within London itself. In terms of excavation waste, that doesn't fall within, I think, the London Plan target, portion target, or forms part of their net self-sufficiency, but because the nature of excavation waste is sometimes it does need to go to certain facilities, but we have also replicated the London Plan policy on 95% of the excavation waste to be put to beneficial use. So that could be being used on site or another development site nearby. And as has been explained, the circular economy statement would set out those kind of details.
Okay, so the circular economy statement actually sets out how do you actually ensure it works?
It is secured by condition or section 106. The circular economy statement is adhered to, and yes, it would set out. So my understanding, for example, on the Warwick Road scheme, was that they did recycle 90% of the waste and this was before the circular economy statement requirements were applied to development. So that is happening on the ground. That's my understanding.
So the council has some mechanism through the 106 agreement or through some statement to actually ensure that it doesn't just get carted off. Okay. I'd just like to very briefly, Ms. Frame.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just where it goes, it's how it goes in the distance. There's a sustainability in terms of just that many vehicles coming in and out, and the carbon factor of those vehicles too. And it's not just that you can take it somewhere, wherever, Hampshire or wherever, but how it gets there and what's the carbon factor taking it there.
I'm assuming like most places that you've got construction. Now those conditions which basically says you have to wrap a route and et cetera.
Yes, yeah, we do that very, very robustly, I would hope, because over a number of years we've developed policies on that, including a very robust code of construction practice, which is referenced in one of our policies. So for all of these developments, including for small-scale basement developments, we require construction traffic management plans, and in fact, the whole basement policy was devised to reduce the excavation waste as one of the reasons.
Okay, right. thank you. Ms. Raymer, it may, whether or not, it's not for me to determine whether or not they do, it's whether
They don't.
there is the,
As soon as it leaves the borough,
there is a
it's not
system
a
to be
problem.
able to undertake it. Ms. Jenny?
Can I just comment that although the intention is there, I think the reality is the traffic management plans involve a number of trucks coming up, often small residential streets. The soil, I think, is shipped out of London. So if we're talking about the climate and we link these issues up, that's why it's so relevant what you give permission to, because inevitably, I mean, Asphalt Aggregates are a company that take a lot of the spoil, and I believe it's then sold to HS2. So there is the construction industry are tying it all up, but for the people who live in the borough, the impact and the pollution and the noise and the destruction of all this soil being shipped out is a very real issue. I have a traffic management plan for 3 buildings around me that's involved, I think it's no less than, I don't know how many hundreds of lorries a week, but we're talking in quite a small road, and sometimes there are 3 lorries all at once. There's a grabber truck and a waste truck and asphalt aggregates. So the reality of the situation is, I would say that it's having a very, very polluting negative impact on the borough.
Thank you very much. We briefly looked at contaminated land in relation to the EA's water protection. My understanding is that there's a statement of common ground. Some main modifications have been agreed. Is that sorry? We did that at the beginning.
That's right, and the table that I circulated this morning includes that modification. It's really the last modification in that table. So once there were a couple of points that have been put together as one.
Okay, definitely I need to ask him more on that. Okay, I'd now like to just close this morning's session relating to the examination of Waterways and Chelsea Political Plan. This afternoon, I will discuss the next steps, which will really give an overview of what will be happening next, but I'm not going to discuss any merits of the plan this afternoon. It's purely administrative issues. So thank you very much, everybody. We'll return at 2 p.m.